Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. The day and age we live in is clearly defined by change. We see it and experience it every day, whether it's in the course of executing our work or just simply getting by. I mean, at times, this constant evolution and transformation can be jarring. It often entails the relearning of processes, steps, protocols, etc., etc. Other times, it leads to massive simplifications and improvements in the way we live and work. Well, on today's show, our guest is someone who has created a business service that, yes, promotes further change in the industry he operates. However, his offering has a very specific aim, which he believes is a complete game changer. Hey, welcome to the show. So, Marc Brown is the founder of Byta, a service where music meets tech. This platform enables everyone to send and receive digital audio in a clean, simple, and secure way. And it is built for everyone working within music today. Now, for Marc himself, he's had an interesting journey, starting out in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, making his way to Halifax and working with Canadian indie legends Sloan before heading overseas to the UK. His extensive music business background and considerable digital audio knowledge has helped him deliver unique insights to audiences from Tallinn to Toronto. Rewinding a bit, Marc got his start in the music business at Murder Records, Canada's premier artist-owned label during the mid-90s. He was also the co-founder of the Halifax pop explosion called Halifax on Music, and he then moved to London after working in A&R at the legendary London Indie Creation Records. And then at Alan McGee's Pop Tones, Marc started his own boutique UK radio promotion company off the back of his success with The Hives. For over 10 years, Marc worked with an impressive list of indie rock luminaries, including, and get this, Wilco, Bloc Party, Bright Eyes, Spoon, and Refused, as well as legends such as Tom Waits, Yoko Ono, Booker T, and Mavis Staples. Marc currently lives and works in Stockholm, Sweden, where he remotely manages and operates his music tech company, Byta. So with all that said, Marc, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the program. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. It's not a bad bio, is it? I was starting to smile. You told me I was going to be off camera while you were doing the intro, so I started smiling. It's not bad. It's a pretty okay, I guess.
Yeah, it does sound all right. It reads nicely. I know off the top for some guests, it can be mildly uncomfortable to hear all that stuff, but at the same time, there is that moment of reflection where you can kind of like rewind a bit and be like, oh yeah, I did that too. And it's kind of nice. I would imagine it'd be a nice sort of experience. It could be a nice experience.
I think it is. And I also, the one thing I wanted to say is you're very good at speaking at a consistent tempo, because I have to do overdubs for our podcast that we do. We do this monthly event, and I speak too quickly. So you're very so not only was the content impressive, the delivery was equally as impressive.
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess that's, comes along with some of the experience in doing this now for the last year or so, but it's still a work in progress, no doubt. But I'm definitely eager to get into all of this with you. I mean, your background and everything, just kind of what I was alluding to off the top, really quite fascinating stuff. So maybe with that in mind, we can jump right into it, if that's all right, Marc.
Sure, let's go for it.
All right. So I've got this first segment lined up, something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my guests know, it's a segment basically I just read off, a definition of the person's profession or business or industry. And it kind of just sort of like sets the tone for the whole conversation. So I went with entrepreneurship for you, and it's a bit of a catch-all definition here. It's quite general, it's quite bland, but maybe after listening to it within the context of all that you've done and currently doing, you'd comment. Does that sound all right?
Okay, definitely.
All right. So here we go. Entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is as the process of designing, launching, and running a new business, which is often similar to a small business, or as the capacity and willingness to develop, organize, and manage a business venture along with any of its risks to make a profit. Very corporate, very straight, very cold sounding. What do you think?
Super dry, so dry.
Right? Exactly. Well, that's Wikipedia, man. That is Wikipedia.
Yeah. But basically, that's true, I guess. But I think you could summarize it in a different way. You could say, like, I don't like that word entrepreneurship, but when I talk to people about who wouldn't know what I do, I say I'm an entrepreneur. So they refer to me as an entrepreneur. But
why like don't sorry to interrupt? Why don't you like the word entrepreneurship? What sets you off?
Because you end up with a definition like that. Like I think it devalues the creativity of what it is. It's creating something from nothing.
Yeah,
I think, and I think it's a very creative process. And yes, there's a financial element attached to it, but you're generally creating something from nothing. And I think that's the part I like to focus on. And I think that's the creative side of it. But that definition is, credit to Wikipedia, is technically right, I guess.
Well, I guess they have to jam all those things into it, but yeah, I would be on your side for that too. I like your idea. I mean, quite simply, that's what it is, right? It's creating something from nothing. And in terms of what you've done, would there be anything else you would add to that definition itself, or is that it's as simple as that to you?
Because it's also like it's quite a broad term. Everybody like, and I didn't like in there that they had something about small business. I think there's a lot of people who work, say, in venture capital, who like to look down on people who run lifestyle businesses. So people who run a business and give them the ability to have a good life. And I think it's like no one type of business is better than another. Everybody does things differently, and I think. So in that way, I would never want to put a value on what kind of entrepreneur someone is. Anybody taking that step into the unknown is technically an entrepreneur. So I'd like to remove the part about the size of business, because I don't think that is important. I think the key is that you want it to be a success, whatever your goal, whatever your definition of success is, because everybody has different definitions, I think.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think that entrepreneurial sort of journey is that personal one. Like you said, it represents different things to different people. And whether it's a small business, medium-sized, large, whatever it might be, I think that's a really, really good point. Now, getting back to your business, Byta, and we're going to get into this later too, but in terms of, I guess, like a typical days, like what keeps you busy right now without getting too deep into the weeds, I suppose, like.
It's our team, our company's fully distributed, which means we don't have an office. We've never had an office. So I just sit at my computer and I and that's where stuff happens, really. Yeah. Or I go for walks. I know you asked me for photos of what I do at work, and I'm like, God, I don't really like. It would be some of the most boring photos ever. But I will pull something out. But because it's not the first time someone's
we'll get 4 different angles of you at your computer, maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but the thing is, I think it's a lot of communicating. So be that via online means, messaging, being on Slack, sending emails, talking, meeting people. I don't necessarily meet many people out in Stockholm for work. But I did last night, for example. So it's just a lot like running a business is a lot about, it's like an idea, but then there's a lot of communication, and it's just talking to people and trying to move it forward. And because a business is built on people. Yeah. And that's really comes from the interaction of the people, I think.
In researching for this talk, maybe it was a podcast I was listening to with you on there. I think it was mentioned that your team is spread out over the globe, essentially. Like I think you have members in Australia or elsewhere. I mean, maybe you could speak to that point a little bit. I mean, it's really
so that's that term. That term I mentioned. It's called a distributed team, and so we started in London. There were 3 of us, and the person in Australia you refer to as Jen, my co-founder. And so it was her and I and someone else in London, and we started it there. And then, but we all worked from home. So we were all sort of consultants or whatever. And then Jen moved to Australia. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the end of the business. So this is, 6-7 years ago. I'm like, this is it. It's over. And then there was no problem. We just sort of talked on Sundays. I talked in the morning. She was online at night. And then it just sort of grew from there. And then the people we have in Canada, the person who contacted you, Colin, who does our marketing, he was my first boss when I lived in Halifax. So I'm like, oh, well, I want to get him involved. And then, you know, we work with a couple other people that Jen knew who live in the UK. And, you know, it's very common now to run businesses like this, like WordPress. I don't know if anybody knows what WordPress is, that runs all those websites and blogs and stuff. That they're fully distributed, the company that runs that. So it's a lot more common, and people ask me like, oh, is it hard? And I'm like, well, it's the way it's always been for us. So no, in a way, I really like it. Like, it's a great way to work.
It certainly sounds appealing, I think. And it sort of shatters that image of what, you know, a traditional business is like, which I also love too. You know, it's like, you can run it in so many different ways. It kind of returns to that definition. Like, it doesn't have to be this cold, hard, fast sort of rule of how you've got to do things. You know, there are several different workarounds, especially nowadays with technology, with this, right? With Zoom, you know, we're having this call here with Japan and then Stockholm, right? You know, like, we can totally do these types of things now. And I think it's a nice eye opener, especially for youth that are kind of like struggling to sort of like see these different options that are presented before them, you know?
Well, it's funny, like, and thinking about your question about entrepreneurship, like, what I don't think, I think people think, especially because of the way the media portrays startups and all, like, it's a lot of it's bullshit, really. Like, and a lot of it's not going to be like that for, you know, people listening who start their own business or whatever. But you can really build it the way you want to. Like, that's the whole point. You're not building a company that you hate. You're building a company you like. And the people in it are the ones that build that culture. And that company could be 1, 5, 10, 20, 30, thousands of people. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I think that's the whole point. It's like, oh, like, we never thought we needed an office, so why get one? Yeah, that's all it is. It's not like there wasn't a manifesto. And it was way pre-COVID. So, you know, we just thought, oh, this is the way we work. Let's go for it. There's nothing to think about, really. And it just ended up this way. And then COVID shows up, and then it's like, oh, everybody's learned how to work from home anyway, so we're all good.
Perfect, man. Perfect. All right, well, maybe we could slide into a new segment here, something called Pathways. And I really like this segment for a couple of different reasons. And one is, like, I think, returning to the point that we're just speaking of, like, people have these preconceived notions of, like, this is how it's got to be, whether you're like running a business this way or that way. And oftentimes too, like, in terms of like how people end up in their business or how people end up in their professional careers, it's like this straight line path. And like, the reality is it's never straight line, like, very, very rarely. So in terms of that, you know, maybe for your pathway, I mean, I sort of spoke to it lightly off the top, but you know, how did you end up where you're at right now within Byta? Maybe we could rewind a little bit here.
So, like, I'm Canadian, and I always liked music from like a very young age. And then I moved to Calgary, and I remember when I moved to Calgary, I'm 48, so this was in the early 90s, I think. And I remember thinking, like, why doesn't Calgary get the gigs that I think they should? Why don't lots of bands come there? Right. And I didn't understand why. And of course, there's a reason for that where Calgary is on the routing and depending on the venues and all that, like, all stuff I know now. And so I just became very curious about that. And then I went to university on the East Coast outside of Halifax in Canada.
All right.
For anybody else who's not Canadian, like sort of near Boston, but you have to drive around. And so this was a time, like, in the mid 90s, when lots of bands in Canada, it was very difficult to get exposure outside of Canada. It's radically different now. You've got Drake and all these huge, ginormous artists across multiple different genres. But back then, you couldn't get arrested in the States. It was terrible. But these bands in Halifax were getting signed to American labels and starting to tour in the US. And so I was going to school in this small town, and we started going in on the weekends to watch bands play. Yeah. And I really disliked university. I was doing, you mentioned earlier, you did sociology. I was doing sociology, and I liked it, but I'm like, I'm just waiting to do the thing that I want to do, which is work in music. So I contacted that guy, Colin, who now works with us. And he ran this band Sloan's label. And I just said, what's the deal? Like, can I get a job? And he's like, no, but you can come volunteer. So, and I know for people,
not a bad deal.
But for people starting out now, because I talk to a lot of students and stuff, like, that's not the recommendation that you should work for free. But I did it. I left the small town I was going to school in. I moved to Halifax. I volunteered for free. Then Colin got me. He felt bad that I didn't have any money. So he's like, okay, I found you these bands to go on tour with in the United States. I did that for a while. We started a festival. And then they sort of ran out of money there in Halifax. So I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to move to England because I had just been there, a couple months before or something.
Right.
And I was young enough. Then I'm like, oh, well, this will go great. And so I moved. Yeah, exactly. Like, and,
Adventure,
I moved to England and I got a job right away and I worked in this record warehouse. And I remember going around the record warehouse, what you would do, this is back when there were still lots of physical products. So you get a list of all the records that the store wanted and you go around and pull them all out. And I would tell the people working in the warehouse, like, oh, I'm going to get a job at a proper label. And they're like, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, great. Yeah, me too. And then, 9 months later, I got a job at this label called Creation Records that was famous for Oasis and Primal Scream, like all these very legendary British bands.
Yeah.
And I worked there, and then they sold the rest of the company to Sony, which is one of the big major labels. And I got let go. I went back to the record warehouse, which was not fun. But then the guy who started Creation called me and said, hey, do you want to come be my PA, my personal assistant? I'm like, why not? I was a terrible PA. Terrible. And so he's like, well, maybe you should do radio promotion. I'm like, sounds great. What's that? And he's like, that's where you try to get songs on the radio. And so I started doing that. And then I sort of lucked out. This was around the time of, I guess it was the early 2000s when guitar garage rock was becoming quite popular. So, which was the last time guitar music was popular in a broad sense, I think. And so I just started working with all these bands and it went really well. So I'm like, oh, okay, like I guess that's what I do now. And so I started this little promotion company. So like just a consultancy business where bands and managers and labels would hire me to get their artists on the radio. And so I did that for about 14 years. And then that's sort of my music business career. And then the way I ended up on Byta was, so I've got a runny nose from, I had the COVID last week for the first time ever.
Okay. Yeah,
so I apologize for anybody watching on YouTube. So what happened was in that period when I was running that, like the job was that you'd send records to people before the music's out in the shops, and you would hope that people would play the record on the radio or write it about in the press. Yeah. So when the record was out in the record shop, people would know to go buy it, right?
Right.
And so you'd send CDs, like I'd sit there and stick CDs in Jiffy bags in little mailers. And it was the time that like links started to become popular back when I think it was You Send It.
Okay.
And all that kind of stuff in Dropbox.
Kind of rings a bell.
Yeah. And it's like, oh my God, like this is no way to listen to music. Yeah. So I thought what we need is a better, and SoundCloud had started and all this kind of stuff. Okay. Well, you know what? People who work with music, this is what they do all day long. They send and receive audio files and streams. And so I'm like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And I thought, okay, well, how hard can this be?
Famous last words, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Famous last words. So I'm like, I found these people, Jen and this guy, Pete, who lived in London. And we started building it together. And so it was just an idea. And I thought, how hard can it be, basically?
Yeah. And there you go. Like, I love that for a few different reasons. One is just like, again, the serendipity of it all. Like, there's a purpose there. Like you said right off the top, like you wanted to get into music. That was the passion. That was the thing. So you've put yourself in all these situations where you were embedded within that whole industry. You didn't know exactly where you're going to end up along the way. And just sort of like one thing would lead to another. And you just kind of kept an open mind all the way through. And, but all the while still knowing that that's where you wanted to be. And then it's just interesting how, again, these paths kind of like, wind this way, they're up, down, around, and then here you are, and again, like I find that so compelling, and it's something that's just like lost on a lot of people. They just have this vision that's like, oh, it's a straight line, simple path. This is what I want to do, and 5-10 years down the road, this is where I'm going to end up. And it just never happens that way. And like your story perfectly sort of illustrates that, I would assume, at least.
Yeah, I've met people and they talk like that I'm going to do this in 2.5 years, and I think like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Like,
Yeah.
And if it goes that way, I always think to myself, well, you're not pushing yourself hard enough.
Right.
If it's not going a bit crazy and not going the way you want it to, it means that it's not challenging enough. But
or you're closing out opportunities, I think, too. You know what I mean? Like if you just have this straight line and you're like, well, no, I'm focused only on this one thing. You know, it can work in certain fields, of course. I mean, if you want to be a doctor and this is the path, and oftentimes it can
you have to be. You have to be.
But in other times, like in a lot of other industries and whatnot, like you can be a little bit more open-minded and sort of like explore things, and you're going to kind of get a better idea of who you want to be, you know, and how you're going to fit into things. So I think that's a big part of it too. But yeah, anyway.
But what's most interesting is my only goal was to get a job working in music.
Yeah.
So I succeeded by
many times
96.
Yeah. Right.
You know, like I did that when Colin hired me. Colin works with us.
Yeah.
That was, I had succeeded.
Yeah.
So all the other stuff, I didn't expect to do anything else. I just thought, oh, okay, box ticked.
Nice.
So that's what's fascinating about it. I didn't really know what was possible because you're young. Like I was 19 or whatever. Like you don't know how things are going to shake down. You don't know what's possible, and that's why it's good to keep, like you're saying, to keep an open mind, because you don't want to shut out things that you don't know are possible.
That's right. Yeah. Some sage advice right there. Well, maybe we could sort of skip on over and do a new segment here, a Q&A discovery. You can kind of just continue this back and forth. And you've already sort of alluded to this with Byta, but I found this, you know, just visiting your website, one of the first things that pops out is like this slogan, this phrase, like Byta is built for music. And again, I alluded to this off the top. You were just speaking to this a little bit more, but maybe you could explain that statement, you know, a little bit further for listeners.
The easiest way to explain it is, if you think, no matter anybody who's listening, you use Dropbox or Google Drive or any of these platforms for, like I pay for Dropbox to store all my Excel files.
Yeah.
And I alluded to this time when, you know, these platforms were just showing up, right? And back then they were new. The whole concept of being able to store files in one place everywhere on all your devices was a very new thing, right? So super exciting. But over time, things have developed so much that everything's become so digitized that there's been a lot of industries and applications that have become very specific. People have built very specific products for certain things. So Dropbox is great if you want to throw a Word file or an MP3 or a couple photos in and just make sure it's everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you work with music, you work mostly with audio files. And audio files have unique properties. So they have metadata, like information that lives in the file, like the artist name and the track name. And there's different versions, like lossless and lossy, like so audio quality.
Yeah. And
then there's a lot of things about security, right? So the whole point with Byta was, it's like, well, you can use these platforms that are built for generic files, any type of files. Or I think because everybody does things digitally now, no one sends CDs anymore.
Right.
It's worthwhile building a platform that's built specifically for music, for audio files. Yeah. So that means that you can take advantage of audio files' unique properties and offer features and functions that make it easier for people who work with audio files to do the job. So you know, Excel, that's great. If you work with Excel files, Byta's not going to be for you. You're going to use Dropbox. But if you work with audio files, you're definitely looking for something that does what you need it to do, and that's what Byta does.
Nice. Yeah, that's exactly it. I think that how you led into that, answering that. I mean, everything nowadays is getting that much more niche down and targeted, you know, specific purposes. And yeah, I can certainly see like how that would fit in. And like from your experiences, again, when you were, I guess, you know, you had your own boutique, I guess, what was it, record company or record
radio and TV
promotion. Radio promotion.
Yeah, so company. It's like doing press. Like it's like doing PR, but for radio and for TV.
Okay. So yeah, I'd imagine at that point, you're seeing some of these pain points within the industry and some of the failings of what was currently available then, and then as you sort of like progressed out of that, kept an eye open, or kind of looking back at that and like, ooh, there could be a better way here. Is that kind of how this idea began to formulate?
That's exactly it. And like I just thought of something like the key to remember here is that this process is part of what people use. I think it might be still be called like unbundling. I think it is that you have one product and then the market opens up where lots of people use that product, and then it breaks into different types of products that are more specified. It's the digitization of the world, basically. And so there's nothing special about what we do. It's just around music. So, but you are right that the key point is if you work in music, you listen to music. And if you're receiving a lot of music and it's difficult to listen, you can't remember where the link is or the file, you don't know who the artist is, all that kind of stuff. Right. It wastes a lot of time. And who does that hurt? It hurts the artist. And so our thing has always been like, look, when you're starting out, you're reaching out to record labels, to managers, you're trying to get gigs. You need to make it easy for these people to listen because you're looking for their help and support at the start. And so that's the real fundamental issue, the thing that everybody can take away from this, even if they don't work in music. It's like people in the music business listen to music all the time. They send music and they receive music. And if you can't listen to what you're being sent or received, it's game over.
There's no point.
Because if you can't hear the music, what's the point, right?
That's right. Alrighty. I've got this other question lined up here. And in terms of the music industry as a whole, I mean, the transformation's been like part of it from the beginning, right? I mean, just in terms of the mediums of like how music has been consumed, whether, we're talking records, 8-track, MP3s, like all the way through to where we're at right now. And I'd love to know like how the industry reacts when further sort of like tech sort of proposals are being put forth. Like how does the industry respond? Is it kind of like we're like, oh no, we're just kind of getting used to things right now, we don't want to like shift it all around again? Or is this sort of like now become part of what this industry represents? Is like, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly making things better. How is the industry react to the advancements in technology or better ways of doing things?
Like that is an interesting question, and it gives me an opportunity to explain like the music industry, which I don't like is a term because it implies that certain people are in the music industry and other people are on the outside, and I don't like that binary thing, so I call it the music ecosystem. And but people still say music industry, but the music ecosystem, what's interesting about it is it's quite decentralized in the sense that you have lots of different, for a record to be a success, lots of different things need to happen. Lots of people need to work together, like managers and artists and record labels. And so when you talk about, say, how would the industry react? Like it depends which part of the industry, right? And so there are like any business or industry, like it could be the pulp and paper industry, like whatever, or the alarm bell business or whatever. Innovation is a threat to existing businesses. So those larger companies, they have felt threatened by a lot of these newer businesses. And then how, say for example, how somebody like Spotify or Apple Music pays a record label, and then the record label pays the artist. Right. That's three different groups of people, and they all have a different perspective because, say, Spotify might say, hey, we don't pay a lot, but we pay more because more people hear it. The volume. And then the record label says, blames Spotify, but then doesn't pay the artist enough because the artist has a shitty contract with the label. So the music business is very chaotic in that way. Very chaotic. Like, but it was very tough 10 years ago. And now I think things are going better. So I think people are happier, but it's hard to be creative industries. No, it's a good distinction. Ecosystem industry. I like that. The reason I asked this question, I was having this really interesting discussion with somebody within the film and entertainment, maybe ecosystem industry, whatever you'd like to call it. Yeah. But we were speaking on points of like sustainability and whatnot, and how that industry has really been adapting a lot of, some of the policies moving forward, and actually sort of like shifting things and like promoting some of these policies that are being like,
adopted by other industries themselves. And one of the reasons for this, at least what I was being told, was that, it's become part of that industry to always find workarounds. If they're filming a shot on a mountainside and there's, shitty weather, well, they still got to get the shot done. They got to find a way. So it's sort of like this cultural sort of like element within the industry itself that's like, find a way. So it sort of like triggered this thought, like within the music ecosystem, I suppose, in the context of this talk, whether or not there are certain, elements of like, yes, keep progressing, keep moving forward. But your point, of all these different players within there, it's a really fascinating one. It's like all the inter sort of connectedness can really, be a benefit to certain companies, as you said, but then can really like close out or destroy others. So yeah, it's fairly nuanced, I would say. At least that's what I'm gathering.
Yeah, but I think like it's all obvious to me because I've worked in it for so long, but then it is complicated. But if you take, say, the film business, like it costs a lot of money to make a movie. It doesn't cost a lot of money to make a record. So the barriers to entry in the film business, like to get a movie in the movie theaters and to get it on a Netflix or whatever, is very challenging. So that creates different dynamics. Whereas in music, you can easily make music and release it on Spotify, but bingo, no one knows it's there, so you've got to promote it and all this kind of stuff. And I think one of the things, like talking about progressiveness, I think like the music business has been historically like, pretty chaotic and not in a good way. And I think the music business has become more professionalized, which people could argue makes it a bit more boring. But at the same time, it has advanced. Like I was reading, somebody posted something today about talking about the company they worked at, acknowledged the union that started, because there's no unions at record companies and stuff. And so there's been a lot of progression in that kind of way. And like, so it's not just technological advancements, it's social advancements, which I also think are good. Just because you mentioned, I sort of alluded to that in the film business, that I think that is one of the positive things, that the tolerance for bad behavior is diminished, and I applaud that for sure.
Yeah. How was Byta received when you first launched it? Like, what was the reaction like?
No one cares. Just like any record that's released on Spotify, 100,000 tracks a day. So you've got to get going and. No, like people, I'm joking. Like people were interested in the idea, but then you're building it as you're trying to promote it. And then you realize that people don't want to be sold anything. So you're attracting people through other means. Like we do a lot of stuff around education. That's a big thing, like doing talks, like that monthly event I talked about.
Yeah. So
we don't do any sales or anything like that because no one wants to be sold anything. So it's a slow process. Change is a very slow process. It's a very slow process.
Yeah. Well said.
For sure.
Okay. Well, in terms of the business itself, maybe more on the technical side of things, I always find this sort of like avenue interesting to explore. I don't know if you will or not, but we'll give it a go here. Part of the premise of your offering is this notion of security, the security of the files themselves. And again, with technology now, it's just like this constant like back and forth cat and mouse game between, like say a company or an individual who's trying to protect things. And then you have these bad actors that are trying to like bust through these walls or these barriers. Now, you yourself might not be involved on the technical elements of your business and whatnot, but, being the founder, of course, you have an idea of what's going on. What is it like managing that aspect? I mean, is that a major stressor for you, constantly trying to like keep on top of things like security protocols or whatever it might be? Or, what would you say to that?
Well, it's interesting. There, like, there's known knowns and unknown unknowns or whatever that, what's his name? Donald Rumsfeld or whatever his quote was. Like the situation is that, you've always got to be conscious of that kind of stuff. It's like risk management.
Yeah.
But I think, so there's an element of all the stuff you should be doing. Then there's all the stuff that is like, let's just be conscious that we want to be smart about how we give our users the opportunity to protect their music, and then they make the choices. Because I think the way we all live today, we know that everything's at risk. It's the internet, right? And so you really just want to do your best to be conscious of all the risks. And that's something we try to educate artists about, because artists are worried about, sending their music to people and then they send it to someone else. Like there are bad actors, I agree. Yeah. But then there's the sort of the dumb leaks. Like somebody sent a link to someone and they sent it to someone else. And then somebody said, oh yeah, sure, use that on the YouTube.
Right.
And then it's like, I haven't even released it yet, So there's do you see what I mean? Like there's these known knowns, like we could be hacked at all times. And that's scary stuff. And that's just something everybody needs to work on and try to be as conscious as possible about, keeping up to date with everything. Right. But then there's also the encouragement about being smart and, being aware that security is something that's important. And what does that mean when you ask that question yourself?
Yeah.
It means to be conscious of it, I think.
Kind of minimizing that other side of the security risks as well. Yeah, certainly an important one too. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that. Yeah, it's definitely the day and age we're living in, for sure. So, all right. And
like artists, when they talk about it, it's like this existential threat. They don't really know. They're worried about. We released the first ever white paper, research paper on music sharing about a year ago. Okay. And like I did some of the follow-up interviews and people were like, I'm worried about security. I'm like, well, what exactly are you worried about? They're like, well, I don't really know. Like, and I think everybody suffers from that now. Yeah. And it's so what we try to do is just sort of quantify that. Like, okay, everybody's worried. What are they worried about? And then you try to give people best practices and all that kind of stuff. And then you try to implement best practices within the company.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a really interesting take on how to sort of tackle that. Yeah, I hadn't really ever heard that before or considered it, that side of it all. Yeah, really quite compelling. Well, I do have one last question in this segment, actually, and this is kind of returning to you and what you've been doing. Again, kind of how we started off this talk. Your career has kind of been embedded within the music ecosystem, but all the same, I mean, there's been a whole bunch of different sort of like pathways that you've been on and everything. A lot of rewarding experiences, a lot of challenging times, I'm sure, as well. But sort of looking back at it all, what does it come to mean to you? At this point in your stage of your career and where you're at.
What does it mean to me? Yeah. Like I'm just glad I got a chance to be involved.
Yeah.
I think the process is way more important than the destination.
Yeah, totally.
Getting to be involved and work with people and try to find a solution to problems is a very exciting like that's the best part of working with any creative endeavor. And like that's what I did in music. I helped artists become successful. I wasn't the focal point. I was a supportive person along that journey. And that's very rewarding to see people's art that you believe in be slowly under time be accepted by a broader audience. And then what we do with our company, like, I'm the founder or whatever, but I spend my time hopefully trying to encourage other people and support other people to get the results that they're looking for. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's, so I spend my time trying to help other people, really. So I love that. Like when it works, you know what I mean? But it's hard. It's the music business, unbelievably hard. Tech business, unbelievably hard. But I guess I like hard stuff.
Well, I think there's a certain degree of reward when you kind of like get through those moments. The more challenging it is, right? I mean, it sort of makes sense in that way. But one other quick question, it just sort of like popped in my head right now. Like you'd mentioned, like being surrounded by creatives, obviously within that industry for a lot, quite a bit of time there. But then having this business that's evolved into like this tech side of things, like almost like two completely different worlds. Like what has that been like, like still obviously having the artistry side of things, and engage with people within that side of the industry, but then also now being within the tech world too. Like how is that?
The what's interesting is it's like to make something successful in music. Again, like you have a team, like there's the band who create music or an artist, and then you have all these people that help them bring that into the world. And so you work as a team, and it's like a little bubble, and you maybe work on a series of those at any one time. But when it's really starting to roll, like a band going from absolutely nobody knows who they are to selling millions of records, it's a very intense thing, and it's very hard to pinpoint exactly why it went so well. The music, because there's lots of good music that doesn't get the attention it deserves. So like working in a startup, it's like a group of people working on something together, and I think that is very neat. So that in that sense, there's a definite parallel, because you can build something and then people don't come and use it, and you don't, like, what's fascinating about it, it's very hard to pinpoint why things suddenly work. A lot of people say they really know, and that's crap, because they especially in music, they'd repeat it again and again and again if they could, and they can't. So that means that there's an element of time and vibes that create something. So that'd be the parallel I would draw between the two.
Got it. All righty. Well, we are shifting in towards the middle segment here, something called a water cooler story segment. And here I just ask, guests to indulge listeners with a story related to their work, profession, business, whatever it might be. And I'd love to hear what you have for us today here, Mark.
Well, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, like, since this is sort of about, jobs and stuff, I think like basically I've been let go from every job I've had in music. Right. Like, made redundant. I don't think I was fired from any jobs, but like all the proper employment job, like proper, I was an employee jobs. I was let go. So I was sort of thinking that, like, that's probably why I ended up doing what I'm doing now, is that, there's no security, but that those are the best things that happen to me. And so that's what I was thinking about, because it's ridiculous, really, that, my first job in Halifax, they sort of ran out of money. Then Creation closed down because they sold the rest of the company. And then Pop Tones, which was the next label I went to work at, they ran out of money as well. And it's like, oh my God, like, this is brutal. So for anybody listening, I think that's what I would talk about. Like, it's challenging, but it's sort of, if you hustle and you keep listening, it sort of works out. But that was the first thing that popped into my mind, because it's a good overview of it, definitely, of my career, but also reinforces the fact that it doesn't go in a straight line. Like,
it comes right back to that point of just like kind of like being open to possibilities, right? And keeping those possibilities open, and then also like considering things along the way, like how you could fit in, or maybe I could do this, or maybe this could work, or maybe if I just shifted things around this way, I could present this new service or product here. You know what I mean? Like, it's just keeping that open mind, recognizing where you're at. I like that.
Exactly. And I think, like, you either keep an open mind or you'll be forced to have an open mind.
Yeah. Well said.
It's going to happen either way. It's going to happen either way. Yeah,
totally. All righty. Well, we are shifting into the very last segment here, something called a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're usually looking towards trends, predictions, so on and so forth, pertaining to the future. Now, I've kind of alluded to this point already in the talk about the music ecosystem being sort of, built on this notion of change, like moving forward constantly. And it's just been part of it. But then also, too, like, it is acknowledged. I mean, there are some purists in there, like you'd mentioned this as well, companies that don't want to see change, like financially, it doesn't make sense for them to have too much change. And then just like on the artistry side, like people just resist sort of like the whole digitalization of it all. Then on the other hand, you have this younger generations coming through, like millennials. They know nothing different than digital transformation. It's just constantly happening. So I'd be curious to know about like what you foresee coming down the line in terms of the music industry in regards to this notion of change, and especially within like tech and digital notions of it, how do you see things going?
So if I'll start by talking the way it was in the 90s. In the 90s, before the internet, it was very hard to get your record released. You could press a record, but you had to get it into the stores. Like you actually had to find someone to put your record in the store, right? So there were barriers to entry.
Yeah.
And that meant that it was hard to be successful because it was impossible to get going. But now anybody can get going. And that decentralization is a very good thing because it means, and that goes back to what I'm saying about the music industry and the idea of gatekeepers, that anybody can release music. And that's very important to me, especially no one should be preventing anyone from doing that. But the flip side is 100,000 tracks being uploaded to Spotify every day. It's very hard to get noticed because there's a lot more competition, no barriers to entry. So that's classic sort of business bullshit. But I think like it's just the future. It feels like it's going to be even more chaotic in a way, and decentralized just because there's so much music. It can't continue this 100,000 tracks a day. Like they do get stored somewhere. So, it's just there, like specifically within music, there's a lot of work to be done around making it simpler. The business of music needs to be simpler because there's the actual audio recording, who owns the song, who owns the publishing. It's pretty chaotic. And that kind of stuff's getting worked out. So from a tech point of view, I see a lot of change for the better coming. And, making it easier for people to release music and then get paid for that is a good thing. And that's what's been going on the last 10 years. So I'm hoping that there's just going to be more of that, really. And that's what you hope digital innovation brings. No one needs digital pony is the first thing or maybe, pardon me. Lots of people need digital ponies, but the music business doesn't need any digital ponies. They need more transparency about payments and agreements and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And that's getting worked on. And that's the kind of innovation that the music business needs. And I think that's the kind it's getting. So digital ponies, very important. But in the music business, rights, transparency, all those things, that's been improving the last decade. And I hope it continues.
Yeah. Well said. It kind of harkens back to a conversation I had a couple months ago with Laura Simpson of Side Door. If you're familiar with that company.
Yeah, I know, of course.
And it's and it's another nice example of how sort of like technology and evolution is coming along, and it can sort of advance, the industry in a different way, and in this particular offering, the artists themselves, especially like ones that are starting out using this platform, you can basically book a band, usually a smaller one, probably anywhere at your own home, a venue that you so choose to hold, something. And that the payment sort of system always, the payment system itself is quite simple and straightforward. And it kind of speaks at the point of just streamlining and making things better as a whole. And I like that notion. I like that idea of how tech can sort of like come into this space and still preserve a lot of the elements that are there and just make it better. There's going to be some challenges along the way, but I like these sort of offerings like Byta as well. Same.
No, I agree. And like the idea of house shows, like playing gigs in homes or whatever, is nothing new, but making it easy for people to do that and making it accessible to other people is what Side Door do. Yeah. And so that's the innovation, and that's the technicals. That's tech being applied in the right way. Yeah. And I think like that's a very good thing. It's bringing more access and transparency. It's exactly what I'm talking about. So that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Yeah. Definitely.
Well, maybe on that note, on these good vibes, maybe we can close things out. But I must say, Marc, it's been a true pleasure. I really enjoyed this. I can't believe we've already blasted through this conversation. I feel like we just got started. But really admired, listening to all that you've said. And thanks for your time today.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Loved it.
Yeah. Well, for those interested in learning more about Marc and his work, of course, you can check him out at Byta, BYTA.com. You can also find him on LinkedIn. And for reference, all of this information will be included in the show notes. You can also rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And yeah, sharing. Sharing is caring, right? If you can get that stuff out there, I think it's all the better. One more thing. Within the last year, I did launch a channel over on YouTube, and you can go check out video conversations. And the cool thing there is we will have some imagery associated with the talk, so you can kind of take it in a different manner. And of course, please don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.